pour être poli, j'aimerais bien parler en français, mais c'est trop difficile pour moi avec les sujets techniques. Alors je vais changer to English. Okay, c'est moi. So we're going to be talking about, these are the 5 subjects, but basically Karine was talking about distractions and defining what it was to be a distraction and how it can affect the situation. I want to start by pointing out the problem specifically here. So these 2 pieces of information here combine to create a problem. And so what it is first of all, we have all these technologies that we've heard about and things that are happening during, so when someone's driving a car, they're looking at screens, they're distracted. And we also have the problem that a vehicle is essentially a weapon. Your brain is connected to 2 tons of metal hurtling down the street at 100 kilometers an hour. And that's all controlled by your brain. So this distraction, if you're watching a movie or a presentation at a conference and you get distracted, it's not a big deal, right? But if you're driving a car, you can send 2 tons of metal through someone's body, and it's not the same situation. So you combine these 2 ideas and you realize we have a problem. And in the realm of science and in the realm of the fact that this is a usability conference and that we all like human-computer interaction, I'm going to focus less on the cup of coffee and more on like the cell phone screen and the iPod, etc. So now just to put a quantifiable sort of aspect on the side of it is that empirical research has actually shown. So not only do we look at the cognitive situation, we look at all the experimental evidence, we theorize with what we know about the brain, but you look at the actual empirical research and we have several studies that make it clear that it is unsafe to be distracted when you're driving. And they use measurement tools like lane deviation, where you have a car like moving along the center of the road, and then you measure the way it drives, and then you measure it while someone is on the phone, and you see that it varies further from the center of the road. Alcohol is the same thing. That's how we first figured that one out, right? So it's not just our theory, it's empirical. Now the problem here is that in 2006, a survey of 5,000 American drivers showed that 40% of people talk on the phone while driving, and in the younger generation, things like text messaging and iPods and things like that are increasing. So as a society, we know this is a problem. It's very clear to us, yet we clearly don't care. And this is a problem. And this is only, like I said, this is only interfaces. If you extend to all the distractions that Karine was talking about, the number approaches 80%, where people admit that they were distracted while they drive. But no big deal, it doesn't matter, right? So in the context of usability, it raises 2 main questions. First of all, as interface designers, can we tailor our interfaces to increase usability and safety? And second of all, how do we test these design ideas without actually killing anyone or sending anyone into a tree, right? Because if you design a beautiful cell phone, you put it in a car and you want to test it, you might end up actually hurting someone. And not only do we not want to hurt people, but in the context of a usability test, you have quite a lawsuit on your hands that would not be fun. So moving on to the cognitive constraint model. So the idea is that we can't actually assume we understand the psychological situation. We can theorize all the things we talk about, the brain and attention, these are all theories. But we can't just assume we know. So if someone came up to you today and you had a project where you had to design a cell phone interface that was useful while you were driving, I mean, we're at a usability conference, ideas can flood and we can have all kinds of interesting ways that we can solve the problem, but we can't assume that we really know how the brain is working. And the best example is this, is if you look at memory, I think many people still, and a lot of people conceptualize memory as a hard drive, that you're storing all the events that you had and then you're recalling them. But science and psychology have proven 1,000,000 times that it just does not behave like a hard drive. It's not the same. Yet we can design things thinking that people remember. And it's a huge problem, in interface design and usability, that people forget that humans don't have such an easy time remembering everything, so we want to lower the burden on memory, right? The same thing goes for attention. But we don't know for sure whether the resources are being divided in a certain way, and we can't just assume it. So what researchers try to do is they try to measure behavior. So they go in, they have people driving, they actually take a look at the way, every single detail about what they're doing, whether they're smoking, doing any of that stuff, and try to build a sort of mathematical model to sort of conceptualize the way that the brain is working. So actually trying to build a little computer program mathematical version of you and understand how distractions are affecting it. Now the problem is it didn't work, and that's a big problem, right? Because what it didn't account for was strategies, is that If you take cell phones, for example, and we're going to talk more about this in a second, but I'm sure, I know we can't admit it, but I'm sure some of you have dialed a cell phone number while driving before, right? And I bet you if we went around the room and we watched, some people dialed the whole number and then looked back at the road. A couple of people dialed a couple of numbers, looked back to the road, dialed a couple more, looked back. You know what I mean? There's different strategies you can take. And you know, it's not the easiest science to figure out why one person is dialing one way and why another one isn't dialing the other way. But what we can do is we can look at constraints of behavior, and we can, now this is, I mean, you know, it's getting late, so I'm not going to get too in detail of that, but basically the cognitive constraint model, what it does is it takes these strategies into account. So you can read the paper if you want to know how, but basically it looks at these strategies. So here, the light gray part represents time spent actually looking at the road and steering, and the dark gray part represents dialing a cell phone. So here is someone who looks at their phone, looks back, right? Here's someone who looks at a phone, dials one number, looks back at the road, takes a quick glance, dials a couple of numbers, et cetera, et cetera. So you take all these strategies into consideration, and you take the reasons and the constraints of why someone would use it, and you build it together, and you build what's called a cognitive constraint model. Now, why do we care about these cognitive models? What does it have to do with usability? What does it have to do with interface design? Two different reasons. Number one, as a designer, even from what I've already told you, thinking about strategies gives you one more weapon in your arsenal when you're conceptualizing how to do this. The other weapon being thinking about strategies, accommodating them in your interface, you know, making sure that they're handled by the interface so the user doesn't run into problems no matter what strategy he uses. But the more important one, as I alluded to before, it gives us a framework to test in-car interfaces with, without actually sending anyone to the hospital. So the idea is that you can test these interfaces without a real driver, without any of the expensive equipment required to run a driving simulator, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like the ideal solution, you would think, because you could run a computer program with your interface. But the problem is, in reality, it's just not cost effective to do that, because what you would have to do is run a whole new cognitive model for every interface. So if you design a phone and it has a button in a certain place and you run it and the model decides, after you've spent hours getting scientists to build yourself a cognitive model, you decide that the one button is in the wrong place, it should have been closer to the 2 button. You change it, you have to get all these scientists over again to remodel the brain to be adaptable to your interface and test it again, even with a slight change like that. And in reality, in a private sector business perspective, like it's just not cost effective to do it that way, right? So